coming back tonight on Wednesday evening. For Jonathan, you have so much musical ability, but my wife, talking about leaning on the everlasting arms, there was something on Facebook that she had yesterday. You may have already seen it, where the minister of music, it just says First Baptist Church, Brackettville. It sounds sort of fishy to me, but it was a guy in a live audience, or an audience, and he was doing What If Leaning on the Everlasting Arms had been written, like during the 50s, and then he would give a verse or two of how they sung back in the 50s and then the 60s, sort of the Beach Boys sound, and the 70s and 80s. He took it on up. It's really good. I don't think it's on my page, but if you go to my wife's page, she's got it on, is it Timeline? Is that what they call it on Facebook? You might want to just go to my wife's page and get it. I don't know how to tell you to do it, but it was just really, really cute. But it was the song, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. And then the very last thing he did is they sang it the traditional way, and it sounded a lot better than if it had been written in the 50s and 60s. Jonathan, I appreciate you being such a gracious host. And if you will, could you give me a copy of how you introduced me Sunday night? I'd like to use that. You can give it to the preacher next week that I'm going to be. That was a very good introduction. I kept wondering who he was talking about. But anyway, I'm still not sure who he was talking about, but I got up anyway. And as was pointed out to you, for some reason that I cannot figure out, the program last night went beyond the capacity of the CD system, and the last 5 minutes or so were not recorded because it could only do 80 minutes. We will not do 80 minutes tonight. I realize now last night probably would have been better to have split it, but I didn't know. See, y'all, I have to experiment with y'all. When I go to other churches, I can realize how long this takes and all, but with you, it's always the first time. So you're the sort of guinea pigs. So I'm going to do just a little bit more review of chapter 7 in hopes that we pick up these 5 minutes, because we're not sure exactly where it cut off. But we're going to start in chapter 8 in a moment with our verse by verse. And this should be the shortest, because all I have is 8 and 9, basically, because chapter 10 is only 3 verses. And then summarize. But I love the book of Esther, and I hope it has been a blessing to you. And the thing I like is it's a story. It's a fascinating story. But it illustrates that God, even though his name is not there, there's no way all this stuff could have just happened. The fact that Esther was promoted to be the queen. What if Vashti, for example, had have come when the king called for her back in chapter 1? Then there would have been no need for Esther could have never been the queen. Then when Haman came and had his decree to get rid of the Jews, there wouldn't have been anyone to speak up for them. So God worked that out. He arranged that. And then how last night it was just when Haman had everything going his way, and even had a gallows built to hang Mordecai, then when he comes in to see the king, they were reading the minutes, how Mordecai had saved the king's life, and the king was determined to reward him, and Haman comes in to ask permission to have him hung, and it turned out that Haman just literally fell into his own pit as we closed last night. But Haman was taken to the banquet in chapter 7. At the banquet, Esther finally revealed to the king what she wanted, which was that someone was out to destroy her people. For the very first time, the king learns, of course, that, she will learn tonight, really, that she was Jewish. But she identifies the enemy in verse 6 of chapter 7 as that wicked Haman. And Haman, of course, in his desperation, appeared to be trying to make love to the queen when the king came back in, and so they had Haman a hood put over him, and he was, verse 8 says it covered Haman's face. They take him out, and hung Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And the last thing we went over last night was Proverbs 26:27, that he that diggeth a pit will fall therein. That is, if we do something for evil. If we try to do things for evil, it will eventually come back to haunt us because we're going to reap what we sow. But that was basically where we got to last night, and I think most all of you were here. There may be somebody that wasn't here last night, but chapter 7, I think I entitled it "The Man Who Came to Dinner," and learned that it was a necktie party because he ended up being taken out to be hanged. Again, it's God's protection of the Jews. Remember what his wife told him? He said, you can't win this game. If Mordecai is a Jew, you will not prevail against him. So we're down to the final section, but remember now, the last thing I told you last night was that all that's happened in chapter 7 is that Esther is now safe. Haman has been hung on the gallows that are impaled on the gallows that he had constructed for Mordecai, and Esther is safe, and Mordecai is safe, but the decree is still out there for the Jews to be killed in the month of Adar, which would be the last month of their calendar. Seems like it was the 13th day of Adar. In other words, there was a specific date, and remember how they chose that date? By casting lots. And the Hebrew word for lots is pur, P-U-R. So because of that, and there's still several months left, but the Jews are under the sentence of death. So keep that in mind as we begin tonight, that what has happened is the bad guy has been put to death, but the decree is still out there. The decree is still on the books, and it could not be reversed according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians. And I will finally explain why tonight, because I have sort of tempted you with that every night, that when they passed a law, it could not be changed. So we'll look and see what happens now, because it appears, humanly speaking, that all of the Jews are going to be exterminated except Esther and Mordecai, because all the others, they're still under that sentence. So verse 1 of chapter 8, and it's an amazing thing here that happens, what will happen to the rest of the Jews. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. That simply means that all of the possessions, remember back in chapter 6, I believe it was, might have been 5, when Haman was boasting, it was chapter 5, I think, when he was boasting about all of his riches, and you remember that I told you he invited his friends over to hear all this. And so all of this stuff is going to Esther. The king basically is taking what Haman had, it would be his property, his house. I don't know what all he owned, but I'm sure it was quite a bit, but it's given to Esther. And then the last part of verse 1, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. What that means is that Esther had told the king that Mordecai was her adopted father, or her basically, legally he was her cousin. But remember that Mordecai had brought her up. So he acted in the role of a parent, even though he was not her real parent. So this is the first time now that the king understands that Esther is Jewish, and there's a connection, bloodline between her and Mordecai. Verse 2, and the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now remember that Haman was the number 2 man in the kingdom. We saw that back in chapter 3, that when Haman was promoted, he became like next to the king. So now, who's next to the king? Mordecai. But that's really unusual because Mordecai is a Jew. The king would be a Gentile. Everybody in Persia, I mean, there was a lot of Jews there, but it's a Gentile country. So anyway, the point here in verse 2 is the king has given the ring to Mordecai. What kind of ring is it? Well, it was a signet ring. It had the king's insignia on it, or perhaps his coat of arms. And when they would melt wax, when they had a law, they would put that ring in there and stamp it on the paper, and when it dried, it would have the insignia of the king. So the point, though, in verse 2 is the king is rather careless. Ahasuerus apparently doesn't have much discernment. Remember, he trusted Haman lock, stock, and barrel. He trusted Haman so much that when Haman says, you've got a people in your kingdom that need to be eliminated, he didn't ask any questions. He just handed Haman the ring and said, go ahead and carry it out. So now he gives the ring to Mordecai. Mordecai is a good guy. However, the king is just more or less giving the ring to anybody that happens to be around. So are you surprised that he will eventually be assassinated? Now, it's not in the book of Esther. The book of Esther closes, I think it'd be about 9 years after the book of Esther closes that Ahasuerus was assassinated. But he was just somewhat, in my way of thinking, he didn't really have a lot of discernment. He just didn't seem to know who to trust or whatever. He's finally got it right now, but Mordecai has the ring, and in effect, Mordecai is the number 2 man now in the country. Verse 3, back to verse 2 for a minute. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now, actually, that seems to be just a normal phrase, but it illustrates an important truth. There is vengeance that needs to be taken upon the house of Haman. Would we all agree with that? Would you all agree with that, class? That Haman's house needs to be punished. However, Esther does not do it. She assigns this to someone else. Now, Romans 12:19 in the New Testament says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So when somebody does you wrong, the best thing you can do is to turn it over to the Lord. Now, I'm not talking about legal things, if somebody has stolen something from me. I'm talking about, personal matters. Turn it over to the Lord. The Lord will handle it for you if you're in the right. It may take a while. The Lord will he'll get to it. And so she turns vengeance over here to Mordecai. And then verse 3, Esther spake yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite. Well, Haman is already dead, but the stuff he set in motion is what she's talking about here, to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Esther, I don't know how much you know about the Persian legal system, but the king cannot change that decree. Anyway, verse 4, then the king held out the golden scepter. Remember, that was necessary to approach him. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, which are in all the king's provinces. A couple things here. Notice in verse 5, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right. Notice that word right. It's on your screen. Right is the Hebrew word kasher, spelled K-A-S-H-E-R. However, when it is translated, it is the word kosher. Have you ever heard that word before? Something being kosher means ceremonially, right. In other words, a Jew will not eat certain things. It's not kosher. They won't eat pork, for example. It's not kosher. And there's certain, it has to be prepared a certain way. What they do eat has to be prepared a certain way. But that is the word here for kosher. If it seems right, if it seems kosher. King, if it seems cool to you. All right? She says, let it be written to reverse the letters. Now, again, watch how tactful Esther is. We have people running for president these days who are not very tactful. But notice how diplomatic she is. The king, in a sense, is just as responsible as Haman, because the king was so dumb, he let Haman have his ring and lets Haman make this decree. I would say he's as guilty as Haman is, but she doesn't blame the king. She says, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and all that. In other words, in all verse 5, she does not blame the king. She could have, but she's being tactful. Of course, too, the king is still the king, and she definitely needs some help here, so she doesn't want to alienate him, but she doesn't blame him. She doesn't say, well, you and Haman devised this, and look what a mess my people are in. Verse 6, for how can I endure to see the evil that shall come upon my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Now this is beautiful. I want you to go back again to verse 3 when she besought him with tears. Esther is safe. There's no way, nothing's going to happen to Esther. She could have just said, well, I've saved my skin. It's too bad about the rest of the Jews. I'm sorry that they're going to be exterminated, but at least I've taken care of my house. You know, that's the way most church folks are. It's just, I'm saved. I'm glad I'm saved. I'm not going to go to hell when I die. But see, we need to be concerned about others who are under the sentence of death. And that's all, everybody, everyone. And so 2 Peter 3:9 says, God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. God is concerned about people, but, you know, we don't seem to be all that concerned in church. And I'm not aiming this at Mount Vernon. You may be very evangelistic, but I'm just saying, in general, the churches that I deal with, we don't seem to be in such a hurry. We don't seem to have that much of a burden. We just seem to be glad that we're holding what we've got. Most churches are just trying to hang on and keep everything on a plateau, keep everything as it was. Esther could have easily just said, well, that's tough about what's going to happen to the Jews, but at least I've saved my family. But she says, I can't endure this. I can't stand to think of what's going to happen to my people. And that's a good object lesson for us. It's good to be saved. It's good to be saved and know it. But we need to always be aware that there are others under the sentence of death around here that don't know the Lord. And I would dare say, I'm not trying to sound like a judge or a smart aleck, but in Appling County, and it would be true in my county, there are many more lost people than there are saved. They're everywhere. It's not like we have to just, roam around trying to find them. They're here. It's just that we pass them every day, and we don't seem to be that concerned. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows. In other words, he doesn't seem to get it. Esther, I've given you what you asked for. We've done away with Haman. I mean, what else can I do? Well, what about the Jews? What about the rest of the Jews? The king, I'm not sure he's all that bright. And y'all might say, well, how in the world did he become king then? Didn't the smartest person be the king? Oh, no. The smartest person doesn't have to be the king. The smartest person doesn't have to be the president. I was waiting on an amen on that one, but he inherited it. He was the son of Darius. That's how he became the king. But anyway, now the problem here, class, is this. Once they passed a law in the Medes and the Persians, that law could not be altered, could not be changed, could not be reversed. And if you want another example, remember in the book of Daniel, because you might be more familiar with Daniel. In Daniel chapter 6, it's the story of Daniel in the lion's den, one of the most famous stories in the Bible. When Daniel was thrown into what happened there is they tricked the king in Daniel, and they told him, to sign this law
that you could only pray to the king for 30 days, and then Daniel kept praying to his God, and they caught him, and they going to throw him in the lion's den. Well, the king realized he'd been outsmarted, but he couldn't do anything about it, because according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, once a law was passed or put into effect, it could not be changed. Now, here's why. The kings in that day of the Persians, people believed that they were infallible. Now, that's a big word. Do you know what it means? They could, without error, that's right. They could not do wrong. See, the Catholics believe that's the Pope's that way. You're not a Catholic, but the Catholics believe that. They believe if the Pope says something, this automatically true because of his position as the Pope. Well, they believe that the king could never be wrong, that everything he said had to be so. If the king puts out a decree to kill all the Jews, and then he were to go back and change that, what would that be saying about the first decree? He made a mistake. That's right, he was wrong. So the king could not do that. He could, because that would be admitting that he was wrong the first time. So it looks like there's no hope for the Jews. Can we have a commercial here and come back in 60 seconds? It looks like, even though Esther's pleading for them, the king, it takes him a while to realize what's going on, but it's more or less that he can't do anything about it. But there is a solution, and it is a marvelous thing here. In verse 8, it actually goes down through maybe even verse 11 or 12 along in there. But the king says, "Write ye for the Jews as it liketh you." In other words, as whatever you feel like should be in it. You write this down and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. Now, I just got through explaining that to you, that they could not change it. But what if the king issues another decree? He doesn't change the first one, but he issues another one. Okay, now I'm going somewhere with this, but let's just move ahead a little bit here and I'll come back. Then were the king's scribes called at that time, and well, anyway, verse 9 is a real long verse, but basically what they do is they call back in the scribes and to write another decree and to put it in the languages. Remember all these different peoples, I showed you on the map, all the 127 different provinces, several different languages, and they were to put it in the language of all these people. And of course, it'll be sent out by the loyal Persian post office. Anyway, I'm having some problems because I was supposed to have gotten something the other day. They said it was, had been sent. I ain't got it yet. But anyway, I need to get the Persian post office involved. Verse 10, "And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's ring and sent letter," oh, there it is, "by post," that's the postal service, "on horseback and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries." All right, now, there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, which side is the king on now? The Jews, okay? He is saying, Esther, you write a decree, and I will sign it. Now, the decree cannot reverse the first one, because that would be saying the king was wrong. But what they're going to do here, and it's going to be clear as we move on down, I believe it's in verse 13, they're going to give the Jews the right to defend themselves. The thing about having the Jews put to death is still a law. But he's saying here, if anybody attacks a Jew on that day, that Jew has a right to defend himself. In other words, if the Jew killed that person, he's not guilty of murder because the king is giving him permission to defend himself. Did you know, dear, the Lord has given us permission to defend ourselves in the battle against Satan? We're in a war. And we have been given permission because Ephesians 6, 11 and 12 says, to put on the whole armor of God, that you might be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. We have been given permission to defend ourselves. Now, we defend ourselves not with our weapons, but with what God has given us. But also, are you aware tonight that if you're a child of God, the King is on your side? That means a lot now, because President Obama may not be on your side. Donald Trump may not be on your side. Hillary may not be on your side. But see, the King is on your side. That's good news. If I was in a black church, they would be getting happy at this, because the King is on your side. In other words, earlier it appeared the King was on Haman's side, see? But now he's on your side. But now this is what blesses me. I don't know if this isn't the thing I get most excited about the book of Esther. Calm down my heart. I've got to be able to explain this to y'all. This is such an important lesson here. All right, the Jews were under the sentence of death, right? All they were waiting on was for it to be carried out. And according to that lot, the throwing of the dice, it would be the 12th month of the year, the 13th day of the month. So they were under the sentence of death. All right, the king could not change that sentence, but he gave them a way out. Now understand that everybody here in this building is under the sentence of death. Ezekiel 18:4, the soul that sinneth shall surely die. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned. This gives me chill bumps. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Everyone in this building is under the sentence of death. You have been condemned because you're a sinner. But God has made another decree. He can't overturn the first one. He can't just say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that everybody was going to be a sinner, therefore I changed my mind. But he made another decree. Acts 16:31, when the Philippian jailer asked Paul, what must I do to be saved? Paul said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, and thy house. Understand tonight, dear, that first decree is still on the books. We're a sinner. We're going to have to die physically. But God made another decree that if you would believe on Jesus, he would forgive you of those sins and you would have eternal life. He can't reverse his first decree, because if he did, he wouldn't be God. But he gave us another chance. All right. Now that is, to me, the spiritual highlight of this book, and it's a fantastic book. But they made another decree, and the king is now on their side. The one who would have condemned them is now willing to protect them. But let's go a little further. Verse 11, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together. They had to gather themselves together now. They have to be united, because they're scattered out. They're not going to be able to be strong enough to defend themselves. To stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault. Watch this now. Both little ones and women, and take the spoil of them for a prey. In other words, the second decree gave them the right to defend themselves, the right to put to death anybody that attacked them, and also to put their women and children to death, and to take the spoil. That means their possessions. In other words, if a Jew killed this man who was trying to kill him, the Jew could get that guy's property or his livestock or whatever he had. However, when you look further down here, you will see the Jews never went that far. They actually defended themselves, but they never killed the women and children that we have any record of, and they did not take their property. So they could have done more. All right, verse 12, upon one day in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar. All right, now this decree is very explicit. The Jews could not just go out killing people anytime they wanted to now. But on that day, which was the day they were under the sentence of death, on that day, the Jews were allowed to defend themselves. In other words, if they kill someone on that day, they would not be considered guilty for it. So the Bible says in verse 13, the copy of the writing for the commandment that was to be given in every province was published unto all the people. Now watch this. And that the Jews should be ready on what day? On that particular day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month Adar. They were to be ready on that day. So here's the thing. The Jews must, first of all, believe the new decree. Have you believed on the Lord Jesus Christ? Then they must not only believe it, they must act upon it. Because had the Jews simply said, oh, this is nice, we got another decree. We got a decree now that we can defend ourselves. But they didn't do anything about it. Guess what would have happened to them on that day? They would have been, destroyed. So, isn't this what the gospel is all about? You must believe it, but then you must act on it. Because faith without faith without works is dead. And so we must act on what we hear. You can sit in church and say, well, I believe that preacher told us the truth. But if you don't act on it, it's not applied to you. So the Bible says they should be ready against that day. And I am telling you tonight that we need to be ready against the day when the Lord's going to come for us, and we don't know what day that is. They knew it was the 13th day of the 12th month, but that's like saying everybody in this building is going to die on the same day. Need everybody to be saved before that day, but we don't know what that day is. It'll be different for all of us. But we need to be ready. So they had to believe the king was on their side, they had to believe the message, and they had to act upon the message. That's the way you're saved. All right, verse 14. So the post, here's our loyal postal system, that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened. Why were they in such a hurry? Oh, because these people's lives depended on it. You know, we need to be in a hurry if we're going to be saved. Did you know that? And people, if a preacher nowadays tries to encourage people to be saved and he says, you know, you may die tomorrow and all, we just say, oh, he's trying to scare us. Well, look in the banner this week. I got mine today, but I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. That is to read it. I did glance over the obituaries. All those people weren't the same age. We don't ever know when that moment's going to come. We need to be ready. I've told the people at First Baptist, I know when you look at me and if you ever have the misfortune of getting out on the highway behind me, I just drag around and drive slow, and I'm looking for deer. You know, I look to the left and I look to the right and I look back to the left. If it's one in the middle of the road, I'll never see it. I'm always looking left and right. But, you know, I just seem like I'm in no hurry. You know, I just drag around. But I am in a hurry spiritually because I realize that people are dying. Funeral homes are not going out of business. Funeral homes, I always like, right before Christmas, just as a joke, if I see a mortician somewhere, I ask them, when are y'all closing for Christmas? Yeah, they don't. There's no way, because we have to be in a hurry. 2 Corinthians 6:2 says, behold, now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. Now is the time. Can I wait till Sunday? I don't know. All I know is God will receive you now. I don't know anything about Sunday. That's you know, I don't know if Sunday will even come, but I know tonight's here. So they had to be in a hurry. Verse 15, and Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel. Mordecai has really stepped up now, because back in chapter 4, we saw him in a bunch of sackcloth out in the street. He couldn't even go into the palace area because he was wearing sackcloth. But now he is dressed in royal apparel, which obviously means that he is the number 2 guy. In the presence of the king, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad, because remember back in the end of chapter 3, I believe it was, they couldn't understand why the king and Haman wanted to get rid of the Jews. Verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness. Why? Because there's a new decree gone out giving them the right to defend themselves. And it says, and many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. We call that a proselyte. It's when a Gentile converts to Judaism, he's called a proselyte. Now, you might say, well, I believe these people switched over and became Jews because they were afraid of the Jews, and that could be that some of them did that. But I think the real reason was they were joyful, they were glad, they were excited, and joy and gladness and all on their faces, and the other people saw it, and they wanted what they had. And I just want to ask you a simple question. If people followed you around tomorrow and looked at your facial expression, would they be interested in Jesus? Some of us, walk around like we have been weaned on a pickle. And we just act like it's a sin to smile. It was enthusiastic. They were joyful. I like Jewish music, and I don't know one thing about music. But I like Jewish music. It's upbeat. And they were excited and rejoicing because now they have hope. They have a new decree that they can now be perhaps not under the sentence of death, but can be delivered. And I think Esther went to bed that night and heard the dancing in the streets and the music going and realizing that she had done what she could to save her people. Chapter 9. It's a long chapter, but basically, to all practical purposes, chapter 9 is going to end it because 10 is only 3 verses. All right, now in the 12th month, finally get around to that 12th month. We've been talking about it all week. That is the month Adar. Now to us it'd be December, but they have a different calendar. It's on the 13th day. Oh, that sounds like the day the Jews were supposed to be put to death. It is. When the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put into execution, in the day the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, parentheses, though it was turned to the contrary, the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together on that day. Do you know there's strength when we work together? That's why, I don't know what y'all call yourself, but if you're a member here, you should call yourself a Southern Baptist. That's what this is, a Southern Baptist church. We have what is called a cooperative program. I'm sure it is not perfect, but there are a lot of churches that just send out missionaries from that church. Well, that's fine as long as the church is doing well, but what happens when they have a fuss at the church and half the members leave? And the missionary is out here on the mission field. He's being supported by that church. Now half of them will quit going. Well, the support drops and the missionary has to come home. So years ago, somebody figured out that there's so many thousand Southern Baptist churches. If all of us would put our, sort of pool our resources, we could put missionaries out and they wouldn't have to worry every year that whether or not I'll be called home because it's several thousand churches supporting them. So if one church drops out, there's still a bunch of others that are supporting it. We just had what we call the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. Well, anyway, here's one of the problems in America, along with a lot of other things, is that Christians are not united. We are being attacked. Our faith is being attacked. Every Christmas it gets worse about what you can do. There's groups that they don't want, the Silent Night to be sung, or they don't want any nativity scenes, and they don't want Merry Christmas to be said, and all. But see, there's enough Christians even in America. If we would just get together, we could stand up and protect our way of life. But as long as on election day, I think I read somewhere, now this may not be completely accurate, but it's probably close. Oh, it's just unbelievable. Something like 54 million Christians, so-called Christians, did not vote in the last election. I mean, just millions of people. And then we fuss about what the government's doing. Why don't you vote? Why don't, and I would never tell you who to vote for, but if you'll study and pray and God will show you what to do. You won't find any candidate that believes exactly like you do, but what you want to do is find one that believes more like you do than the other one. But we need to be involved. We need to be work. But not only that, we won't work together as churches. I am just so thankful. I'm thankful now. I'm not bragging. I am thankful that now the First Baptist Church and the First Methodist Church and Woodlawn now has joined us. We have Fifth Sunday together. But it's just so hard to get churches to even cooperate. We claim to be cooperating, and yet we get mad if some other church steals some of our members. Well, did they lose their salvation when they moved to that other church? Isn't there just one heaven? Are the Methodists going to the same heaven we are? If they're saved, they are. The Church of God. But, we have to work together. I just get so frustrated when I see there's several candidates that claim to be running for president. I am not sure there'll be an election this year. I predicted for 2 years that there will not be, but nevertheless, I don't say the Lord showed me that. That's what I believe. But if there is an election, we have candidates right now that are just making, trash talk to each other, and the people watching, they just decide all of them are crooks. And, so they sit home on election day. I mean, I just can't believe this is so stupid to have these so-called GOP debates. Why would you want to debate another person who believes like you do? I just don't get it. And then we wonder why the Republicans lose these elections. I say it is 4 letters, dumb. But and I'm not a Republican. I'm like Franklin Graham. If I was a Republican, I'd be getting out because they haven't changed anything in the last year or two since I've been in Congress. You know the difference. But we won't work together is what I'm getting at. But the Jews, they gathered themselves together. Did I tell you all this earlier? Forgive me if I did. But in the land of Israel, they have I think I did tell you, they have a lot of political debate in Israel. They have different parties over there. They don't get along so good either. But when it comes to defense, they join together because otherwise they'll be destroyed. And by the way, North Korea supposedly detonated a hydrogen bomb today. You might want to keep an eye on that because remember from Sunday night, the number one meanie place in the world is North Korea. Well, anyway, I'm sure our leaders will take care of it. Moving on down, I'm also waiting for Santa to arrive. Today is Old Christmas Day, by the way. It's called Epiphany, if you happen to see that on your calendar. It's the 12th day of Christmas. So I'm still in the Christmas mode, but after tonight I won't be. But anyway, the Bible says in verse 3 and 4 here, basically that the fear of Mordecai fell upon these people who wanted to get rid of the Jews. Mordecai was great in the king's house. His fame went throughout all the provinces. For this man, Mordecai waxed greater and greater. You almost wonder why the name of this book isn't the book of Mordecai, don't you? Mordecai is more of a hero. Esther, though, was the queen. Thus the Jews smote their enemies that day and did what they would unto those that hated them. But you'll notice here they didn't kill their women and children. And it very plainly tells you in verse 16 and verse 10 that they did not take their spoil. They didn't take their possessions. We don't have any record that they killed the women and children. In verse 6, how bad do you think this would be? The king sent out a new decree now. Mordecai is now the number 2 guy. The king is giving his power and his authority on behalf of the Jews, giving the Jews the right to defend themselves. You would think on that day nobody would be stupid enough to attack the Jews, but watch this. Verse 6, and in Shushan the palace, just in that palace area, they killed 500 men. I want to go back to a verse, chapter 4, Verse 13, when Mordecai was trying to get Esther to intercede on behalf of the Jews, remember what he told her? He said, if you hold your peace, you will not escape. Don't think now because you're the queen that they're going to let you by. Now there's 500 people that were in the palace area that were anti-Semitic all along. In other words, they hated the Jews and wanted to get rid of them. Surely they would have killed Esther that day had she not done something. Mordecai was right. Then beginning verses 7 to 10, we have some names that I'm not sure anybody can pronounce. And it's all right, but these are the 10 sons of Haman, listed here in verses 7, 8, 9. And it says, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. So, not only was Haman anti-Semitic, guess what? So were his sons. But how do people become prejudiced? They're taught. Okay? They're taught. They killed the 10 sons of Haman, but on the spoil laid not their hand. In other words, they didn't take the possessions that they could have. In other words, Jews could have been more, could have done more than they did. And then with the king, and that's just in the palace area now, and they give a report to the king, and he asks in verse 12, he says, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the provinces? It's almost like election night. Has the results come in from the other precincts? We have 500 that were killed right here in the capital city who were anti-Semitic. And so he says, Esther, is there anything else I can do for you? And Esther says in verse 13, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan, remember that was the capital, to do tomorrow also according to this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. Now, a couple things here. Esther asked for an extra day. But now she asked for an extra day just in Shushan. That is why to this day some Jews celebrate Purim as one holiday and some celebrate it as 2 days. In other words, they have a 2-day celebration. Now the great majority is 1 day. I am not sure how many people do it for 2 days. And I'm going to talk to you about the feast in a minute, what they do today, the Feast of Purim. But anyway, why would they hang these 10 sons since they were already dead? The answer is that was to be an example to let other people know when they passed by and saw them hanging there, this is what will happen to you if you dare to try to kill the Jews. If you become anti-Semitic, in other words, it was to teach them a lesson. Yeah, they were already dead. It's not that they were going to make them any more dead, but it was just to be a visual to let people know that this is the outcome of Haman's rebellion against the Jews. Verse 15, for the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day. Now this is the second day. See, the thing was the 13th day. That's when they killed 500 in the palace area. All right, on the 14th day, because remember Esther asked for an extra day, it says they slew 300 more. So you see why they needed another day? In other words, I just want you to understand, dear, this thing was deep-rooted. And remember what I told you last night? According to polls, 15% of Americans are just like these people here. Hate the Jews. Now, obviously, a lot of that 15% are Muslims because almost all Muslims would hate the Jews. But they're not 15% in this country. We don't have 15% Muslim yet. I don't know what it is, but it's probably around 6 or 8% nationwide. So there's a bunch of people hate the Jews now. So don't think this is just something, this is another reason I wanted us to study this, because don't think this was just something that happened a long time ago. Those people were crazy. We're in an enlightened generation, you know. I'll tell you how enlightened we are. Do you remember Nazi Germany? It's only been less than 70 years. Adolf Hitler had 6 million Jews exterminated. Don't think now that we've outgrown this, that the world is, that is something of long, long ago and the hatred of the Jews has passed away. Oh no, in fact, it is getting worse. Almost all the time you'll hear, now the news media don't spend a lot of attention on this, but they'll occasionally mention an attack on a synagogue somewhere. It's going on. And America, our leadership, has been turning against the Jews for the last at least 3 presidents, maybe longer. Well, anyway, verse 16, but the other Jews that were gathered in the king's provinces, now these are outside of the capital city. Remember, 500 were killed in the capital the first day, 300 the second day. But what's going on in the rest of them? The Bible says that 75,000 were killed. Now that's the total when you get all of these countries in here. 75,000 were killed. So, I'm telling you that it was deeply ingrained, a hatred of the Jews. It has been going on throughout history. But history is also strewn with the wreckage of countries that have opposed the seed of Abraham. And we will not escape. If you want America to be destroyed and fast forward, just let America keep going down the road of being against Israel. Now, does that mean that Israel's right about everything they do? We should support every single thing they do? No, they're not always right, but God has promised that He's going to set up a kingdom there one day. And when Jesus comes back, He's not going to rule from Baxley or Hazelhurst or Washington, D.C. He's going to rule from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in Israel. All right, verse 17. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day, they finally rested after they had defended themselves and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But anyway, remember now at Shushan it takes them 2 days, so that's why verse 18 talks about after the 14th day for one group, after the 15th day for another. So verse 19, they made it a day of gladness and feasting and a good day and of sending portions one to another. Sounds sort of like our Christmas. They send gifts, and they still do at Purim. All right, verse 20, and Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far. Now, remember Monday night, the very first thing I said to y'all almost Monday night was the question of who wrote the book of Esther. And I said, well, we don't know. And some think Ezra did, and some think Nehemiah did. And remember, I told you that my candidate would be Mordecai. This is the verse. Notice it says, and he wrote these things. I don't know what all that means, but it could be that that's telling us that Mordecai wrote the whole book, which is what I think, but I can't prove that. But it's just what makes sense to me. Whoever wrote it had to be an eyewitness and had to know something about Persian culture, and Mordecai would be in position to do that. Anyway, the Bible says in verses 21 and 22 that this became sort of a holiday to them. Notice in verse 22, it's the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month was turned from sorrow to joy, from mourning into a good day. They should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, that's gifts, and gifts to the poor. Now we see that it is not like our Christmas, because at our Christmas we send gifts one to another, but we don't usually send gifts to the poor. Now, I know some churches say, oh, well, we have baskets that we take out, and we do so-and-so, or we give our broken down toys to the Salvation Army or to Goodwill or somebody, We do a little bit, but basically Christmas is become a swap. You get me a gift, I get you a gift. On the day after Christmas, we both meet at the store taking them back. But anyway, the Jews here about gifts to the poor, I want to just update this for a minute, this is a breaking news alert. Did you know that even to this day, Jewish charities do their main business at the time of Purim. In other words, it'd be March 24th this year. It peaks around the time of Purim, the Jews giving gifts to the poor. Anyway, they go on here and mentions about verse 24, but Haman, because he was the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and he cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But remember now, Proverbs 16:33 says, even the casting of the lot, said the lot is in the lap, but the disposing of it is of the Lord. And so the Bible says in verse 25, when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he had devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head. I would say it had. And that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Well, we've already talked about that. Wherefore they call these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Now, are you ready for your evening Hebrew lesson? Is everyone awake? Look around now, see if anybody's asleep. Wake them up if you see anybody asleep. And if they're deacons, give them 2 elbows. All right. How do we make a word from singular to plural in English? What do we do to it? We add an S or an ES. Okay? So the plural of horse is horses. Okay? The plural of, most any word, you add an S or an ES and you make it into a plural. But in Hebrew, you make a word plural by adding IM on the end of it. Okay, so pure is singular. To make it plural, it is Purim. The word cherub, for example, the angels who are known as cherubs. The plural of cherub, though, is not cherubs, it's cherubim. So just a little Hebrew lesson. It'll pay off tomorrow morning at the Huddle House for y'all when you go in and impress your friends with that knowledge, which I'm sure they have been thirsting for, is that I am added to a Hebrew word makes it plural. All right, so that is why there is called the Feast of Purim. And I will explain, I know I've said it all week, but in a minute now I'm going to explain this. Well, anyway, verse 27 says that for some people it would be on 2 days. They would keep these 2 days because remember it took them 2 days in the palace area. The appointed time every year. Purim is always exactly 1 month before Passover. So I am assuming, I have not looked at the calendar this year, but everybody tells me that Easter is coming early and that Easter will be in March this year. Easter is usually in April. Well, most of the time, Passover and Easter are, usually within 4 or 5 days of each other. In other words, close together. Because when you think about it, Jesus was crucified on the Passover. But this year, apparently, Passover, if Purim is not until March 24th, that would mean that Passover wouldn't be until April 24th. By then, Easter will be long gone. So I think our calendar's all messed up. Well, I think that anyway when it's 83 degrees on Christmas Day. Something's wrong around here. But anyway, it tells in verse 28 that these days were to be remembered as a memorial. And Esther wanted that. It wanted to be a memorial that every generation would remember. And of course that's true because here we are studying Esther 2,300 plus years after it happened, 2,400 years after it happened. We're looking at it. It's important to have memorials. That's why I believe in Memorial Day, Veterans Day, because ask young people about World War II and see how much they know. They know about cell phones. They know about texting. I don't know anything about a cell phone, but I know about World War II, and we don't need to forget because almost all the veterans of World War II are dying. There's still a few thousand left, but they're going quickly. Anybody that fought in World War II would have to be now around 90 or above, so there are not many of them left. We need to remember. So The latter verses here is 29 to 32 is basically dealing with that they were to remember this, they were to make it a memorial. Verse 31 even says, for themselves and their seed. In other words, they were to teach their children about it so that their children would know and to remember that. All right, let's go down to chapter 10, 3 quick verses. It's all about Mordecai, really, but verse 10, I don't understand verse 1. It says, the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. So, that just means he added more taxes. What leader's not? Who is reducing taxes in the world? Oh, everybody that runs for office is going to reduce them, right? That's what they tell you. When they vote for them, lower taxes. Hadn't happened yet. It's not, pardon my English, but it ain't going to happen. Because a lot of people may think, if I get into office, I'm going to lower the taxes, but you get in there and there's so many things that they find they can't do it. But I don't know why that's there. I mean, it doesn't, here we are, we're all excited about Purim, and this verse says, and the king added some more taxes. I don't understand it. But I don't have to understand everything. I mean, it's part of God's word. I'm not saying it shouldn't be there. I'm just saying I don't see how it flows with the story. Verse 2, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not all written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Well, I would say yes, even though I hadn't read them. But Mordecai, as we end the book, is a great man. And that's important because verse 3 says, Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews. Who was it did Jesus say? He said, you will be honored everywhere except where? And among your own people. Okay? Remember, Jesus grew up where? Nazareth. Okay? He was born in Bethlehem, but he didn't grow up in Bethlehem. He grew up in Nazareth. All right, when Jesus was 30 years old, he began his public ministry. Guess where he started? Nazareth. Guess what they did to him? They ran him out. So he moved on down the road to a village called Capernaum. Jesus made a statement, a prophet is not without honor save in his own country and his own house. If you don't understand that, what he's saying is that a prophet is recognized, but among his own people, they don't necessarily honor him. Have you ever had the experience of going to school with somebody and then that somebody you sat next to in school and you threw spitballs at them and did stuff and pulled their hair and then they become elected to an important official and whatever and they become important? Can you imagine how people felt that went to school with Jimmy Carter? I mean, he grew up in Plains, Georgia. Smaller than Searcy, isn't it? Plains. Can you imagine when he becomes president? And they say, Jimmy Carter. I sat next to him in school. Well, we rode the same bus, In other words, if I want to get respect, I have to leave Hazelhurst. A boy asked me one time, he said, why are you always preaching somewhere else? He said, why don't you preach around here? I said, I have to go somewhere where they don't know me. But, seriously, and I'm just serious now. I used to go to Mississippi every year. I don't go anymore, but I used to go. And people around here have been good to me. I'm not whining now. I have been blessed. Oh, I have been blessed. If y'all knew how sorry I really was, you'd never let me in the door of this church. I have been blessed. But I did get a lot more respect in Mississippi. They all want to know about Georgia. Where do you live? How far is that from Atlanta? Whatever. What kind of weather do y'all have? And all this stuff. In other words, nobody around here wants to know that because you're here. So Ahasuerus even the Jews liked him, and he was a Jew. All right, notice this last verse. For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. Now I want to ask you all a question. When you read the life story of a famous person, how does it always end? I used to read comic books. That's why I got interested in history. I used to read comic books. Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Kit Carson. You know, I like Westerns. Guess how they all ended? Go look up somebody on Google. Google Sir Winston Churchill. Read about his life. Guess how it ended? He died. It always tells you about their death. Did you notice here Mordecai's death? No. Does that mean he's still alive? No. Here's what it means, dear. 1 John 2:17. He that doeth the will of God abideth forever. It's the idea that if we do God's will, our influence will go on forever, though we will be gone physically. Nobody here is going to live physically past probably 90 or 95. You might make it to 100, but that's, we're not going to live here very long. But it doesn't record Mordecai's death. So I don't know how long he lived after. The king lived 9 more years and he was assassinated. I would think now, I don't know, I haven't studied all this stuff. I don't have time to study Persian history. But I wonder when the king was assassinated if they didn't get rid of Mordecai at that time, because he was connected to the king. Well, anyway, what can we learn from the book of Esther? And then I'll talk about the Feast of Purim, and it won't take long because I don't know much about it. But what can we learn from this? Well, I think there's a couple of big lessons. Number one, God likes to use ordinary people to do extraordinary things. God delights in just using ordinary. Look at some of the people in the Bible that are so well known. What about Moses? Moses was 80 years old when God started using him. 2 million Jews approximately are slaves in Egypt. Would you want an 80-year-old man leading them out? Would y'all vote for an 80-year-old man for president who hadn't seen a major city in 40 years? God did. Look at Jonah. He preached the greatest revival in the history of the world, that revival at Nineveh. But he ran away from God, the runaway prophet. And then when people started getting saved, he pouted about it. But God used him. What about Rahab the harlot? In other words, Rahab the prostitute. Surely God wouldn't use somebody like that ran a house of ill repute. Well, when they wanted to hide the Israeli spies, Rahab the harlot was the one that did it. Because she believed in the God of Israel, God spared her and her whole house. I'm just saying, God, he used a little Jew with probably poor eyesight, and according to history, was probably humpbacked, had a thorn in the flesh, wrote most of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul. In fact, at first, he started out trying to kill all the Christians. God used Peter, somebody that denied him 3 times when Jesus was on trial. When Jesus needed a friend, Peter denied him, and yet he became the leader of the early church. Have I made my point, class, that God likes to just use? See, we look at people who have degrees from Harvard, highly educated, Oxford graduates, someone with great charm and good looks and so forth. In fact, that's what got Israel in trouble when they got Saul, their first king. You know why they chose him to be king? Because he was better looking than everybody else. The Bible says he was taller and good looking. God had to get rid of him, get David, a shepherd boy, in. Just a shepherd boy. So God uses Esther, who was an orphan. Would have been a nobody in the world's way of looking at it. The second great lesson from the book of Esther is God will not allow the Jews to be destroyed. And y'all can take this to the bank. He will not allow the Jews to be destroyed. Iran may start a war with Israel. North Korea may start a war. Somebody else may try to attack Israel. Now, if y'all don't believe God is going to keep Israel from being destroyed, just think about why haven't they already been destroyed? They've got There are 1,600,000,000 Muslims in the world, 1,600,000,000 Muslims. There are only 13 million Jews. They're outnumbered enormously. Why don't they just go ahead and squash Israel and get rid of them? Because God won't let them. The very fact that there is an Israel today is a testimony that God is going to. Now, that doesn't mean the Jews aren't going to have some hard times. If you'll study prophecy, you'll see that 2/3 of them will die during the tribulation, but 1/3 of them will make it through it. And when the Messiah comes back, they'll recognize him this time, and he will set up his kingdom in Israel. So I told you all week, I talked to you about the Feast of Purim, just real quick. They have a celebration every year to remember Esther. It's called the Feast of Purim. And by the way, they claim there's more manuscripts of the book of Esther than any other book of the Old Testament. That's what I've read now, that there are more manuscripts of the book of Esther. They call it the Megillah, which means a scroll. They go to the synagogue, and by the way, the sad part is Romans 11:25, Paul says the Jews are in partial blindness. A lot of Jews celebrate Purim just for their children's sake, because it's a day of gladness, of giving gifts. It's a feasting and parades. They have parades, the masquerades. They dress up. If you want to get in on one, go to Tel Aviv. That's where the biggest one is, the largest Jewish city in the world, Tel Aviv, Israel. And there in Tel Aviv, they have floats, parades, banners. They have loudspeakers that read the book of Esther over and over to the people, of course in Hebrew. And everything there is based around the Feast of Purim. It is not a holiday like, they have work. It's not like a Sabbath, because it's a glad day. It's not a solemn day like the Passover or Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish New Year. It's not like that. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, rather. Rosh Hashanah is the New Year. But the Feast of Purim is a time of gladness, as I said, of parties. And they go to the synagogue. Some of the Jews only go once a year, and that's Purim. Think about some of our members that only come at Christmas and Easter and maybe Mother's Day. The real dedicated ones come back for Mother's Day. They come 3 times a year. It really is it's really hard sometimes when you have a big crowd on Easter Sunday to just say Merry Christmas, because you won't see them again until Christmas. But, you don't want to be ugly, and just hope maybe the Lord will get hold of them that day. But a lot of Jews go to the synagogue just once a year because they're not there right now in blindness. And they have a scroll, and they read the book of Esther. And every time they come to the name Haman, they stomp their feet, they boo, some of them curse. Sometimes they have these noise makers, they clank, clank, clank to drown out the name of Haman. In other words, they hate even to this day now. I'm talking about now. We're not talking about in Esther's day. Now, when they read the book of Esther, they come to the name Haman, they make a bunch of noise or boo or cuss or do something, so they won't hear his name. They have certain foods that they have at Purim. That their most famous one, and I'm not an authority on Purim, but it's called, if I can pronounce it right, Hamantashen. And it is a triangular-shaped pastry. Now, I like pastries. I don't care what shape they are. But triangular-shaped pastry, and the reason they call it Hamantashen is because supposedly it resembles Haman's cap that they would have worn back then, a triangular-looking thing. And it's filled with fruit, or I think the main thing is poppy seed. They also do it with prunes. I don't want that one. Give me the poppy seed. Now, here is something and it's okay if a CD doesn't pick this up, because I'm just talking about the Feast of Purim. They celebrate it every year. It's almost always in March, but it's usually in the early part of March. I mean, maybe I need to go back and look at my stuff again. I may have read the wrong thing, but I think I read March 24th. But, of course, you won't know it anyway. It won't be celebrated here. But if you were in an area that had a lot of Jews, they do make a big deal of it. But it's just a day of feasting and gladness and so forth. And one of the things, though, and I don't like this, but I'll just go ahead and tell you, the Jewish rabbis years and years ago said it was all right on Purim, since it was a happy day of rejoicing and gladness, they could drink. They could imbibe a little alcoholic beverages. In fact, they said it's all right if you drink enough that you won't know the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. In other words, you'll be drunk as a coot and you won't know what somebody's saying. But now that's not in the Bible. The Bible doesn't tell them to do that. That's what tradition say. The Bible doesn't tell you to have a Christmas party either and everybody get drunk. But it's tradition. So all that stuff happens even now at Purim. And it is because of the book of Esther. So in a couple of months, March 24th rolls around or whatever. Y'all may have forgotten about Esther by then. But you might just see something in the news about Purim. It begins at sundown on one day and sundown to the next. So they still keep the story of Esther. See, a Jew might not accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah, but he believed in the book of Esther. And that's an important book to them. So I hope it's been a blessing to you. But tonight, Jonathan, do we have anyone that plays the piano here? Okay. Maybe let's just have a verse or two, because I never know what people are thinking, or, you know, it may be that everybody here has been saved. I certainly hope so. I mean, I understand this is Wednesday